Thanks for tuning into the Business of Story. I'm Park Howell, and my mission is to bring you storytelling resources and artists from around the world to help you excel through the stories you tell, and hopefully entertain you along the way. Now, I was curious about today's guest, Vivek Shankar, when he reached out to be on our show. You see, I get between 10 to 20 guest requests every single week and carefully curate who I think will deliver you the best insights, tips, and techniques to help you grow as a more clear, concise, and compelling storyteller. Of those requests, 1 out of 50 make it on our show. Vivek caught my attention because of his work helping B2B companies know what stories are going to land by first truly understanding their audiences through powerful research techniques. So, if you want to truly understand your audience and which stories will engage them, then this episode is for you. But first, let's quickly talk about the ROI of storytelling and how you can measure its impact on your brand. Now, in 2020, I published my book, Brand Bewitchery. In Chapter 3, titled Stakes, How to Connect with Wishes and Wants of Your Customers, I talk about the Significant Objects Project that demonstrates the return on investment with brand storytelling. In July of 2009, Joshua Glenn, a cultural and brand semiotician, you had to look that up, a semiotician essentially means a sign guy, and his business partner, Rob Walker, a journalist who writes on material culture, launched the Significant Objects Project. They wanted to understand buying behavior relative to storytelling. So they published what they called a literary and anthropological experiment to objectively measure the effect of narrative on an object's subjective value. They purchased 100 tchotchkes, knickknacks you can find in thrift stores like Goodwill, for an average of $1.25 a piece. Then they hired creative writers to attach a fictional story to each object and sold the items at auction on eBay. For example, they purchased an acrylic encased globe for $1.49. Guess what it sold for because of its story? $197.50, making meaning and money out of the mundane. Glenn and Walker invested a total of $128.74 for the first collection of baubles, and they sold that collection for a combined $3,612.51, creating an ROI of around 2,800%. They said that the stories are such a powerful driver of emotional value that their effect on any given object's subjective value can actually be measured objectively. Okay, so let's fast forward to a couple of weeks ago when we all witnessed the same storytelling phenomenon on a grand scale. The absurdist Italian artist Maurizio Cattelan, I'm not even sure I said that right, bought a 25-cent banana from a Manhattan Street vendor, attached it to a white wall with duct tape, and then called his conceptual art Comedian. He then sold it to cryptocurrency entrepreneur Justin Sun for $6.2 million for the piece. I think the joke might be on Sun, who apparently has more Bitcoin than brains. Cattelan, on the other hand, created a roughly $6.2 million ROI by reframing this mindless artwork with a story. But what it really illustrates is that we are truly a planet of storytelling apes. So what stories are you telling to evolve your commoditized product or service offering into an appealing treat? Today, you learn how to craft your stories from a B2B content marketing expert who will help you turn customer pain points into growth strategies through the stories you tell.
You learn as best as you can. You publish your messaging, which I like to call the testing phase, right? The third is basically you refine it. So you get feedback based on whatever content you're publishing out there. Seek feedback, more importantly, because a lot of companies don't actually seek feedback. They just want the results to come pouring in, right? So seek feedback, and then refine based on that. And once you start taking all these feedback, the data that you get from there into account, you'll tweak your story, right? And it's a process of constantly tweaking it, because sometimes your audience, they might prefer that you meet them somewhere else.
Vivek Shankar is a fractional content marketing strategist who explores why few companies have a handle on what their story is and how to communicate it in an audience appropriate way. Conducting audience research by asking the right questions is how you solve this issue. He has worked with unicorns like Ramp, established companies like VersaPay, and fast-growing startups like Numeric. He lives in Lisbon, and he's ambivalent about the Oxford comma, whatever that means. So please welcome to the Business of Story, Vivek Shankar. Vivek, welcome to the Business of Story.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Park. Thank you for having me. Glad to be here. Yeah.
And you're coming to us from where?
I am in Lisbon, Portugal. Usually really sunny, but unfortunately today we're having some rain. But yeah, it's a wonderful place.
Did you grow up in India?
I did, yeah. So I grew up in India, and then I actually left India when I was 17 and went over to the States. So I studied engineering, which is, so I currently work as a content marketer for B2B companies, but it's a funny thing, like all of us who work in content marketing, we seem to have these bizarre backgrounds, right? So you take my case, I grew up in India, I went to the States, studied engineering, then worked in finance for a while. After that, ran my own business in India for a while, and then finally sort of found myself somehow in content marketing. So that's the highly shortened version of my background. Yeah.
So engineering, where were you in the States?
I was at Ohio State, Columbus. Sorry, the Ohio State
Oh.
University. I must mention.
Yeah, you can get rid of that "the" thing. That's okay.
I
Just
know.
kidding you.
I know you are a football fan, so I just had to throw that in there. Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. So what is it you think with like the intersections of your engineering and your B2B work and so forth that got you into content marketing?
I've always been a creative writer. From a young age, I always wrote creatively. And then at some point during the last decade, this was after my first business, I found myself, trying to get into affiliate blogging and this kind of thing. And the writing skills carried over. It was just the getting found on Google that was the important bit that I had to teach myself. So once I sort of did that, it was just an extension. Content marketing just became an extension of that. And the way I think of it is content marketing is really just telling a story that helps you position your product in an optimal way for your customers. And, getting found on Google and all that, that's kind of like secondary. The story is what comes first. And positioning and understanding how to position yourself is important. So, being a pretty curious person, I was, and also more importantly, having been on the other side of that conversation as a business owner, understanding like how marketing can go wrong and how, let's face it, sometimes marketing can sound a little, BS like with all the terms and everything.
Sometimes, you mean all the time.
Would we be marketers if we didn't make up terms, right? But yeah, having been on the both sides of that conversation, I found that yeah, it's a super interesting place. I started off just as a writer, but then pretty quickly evolved into being a marketer as opposed to just just somebody who writes words on a page. So yeah, it's been an interesting journey so far. Yeah.
In your experience, where have you seen marketing go wrong? Because I know one of the notes you sent me before this show was that so many people profess that marketing is the most important thing in a business, and you push back against that.
I do, because I think I've been a business owner, right? And I think it's quite natural, I think, for anybody who excels at their profession to sort of have a certain pride attached with it. And I feel marketing is the same way. But, I spend quite a lot of time on LinkedIn, and I used to on Twitter as well, not anymore. But one of the constant themes on marketing social media is, it's almost stereotypical at this point. Some marketers on there saying, oh, the difference between a founder of I don't know, 100 million ARR company and one that doesn't make money is marketing, right? I mean, no, frank, respectfully, no, right? It's fine to
You don't
sort
even
of,
have to be respectful about it.
I mean, it's,
Vivek, I mean, it
yeah,
comes down to the product, right? Or the service. How good is it? Because great marketing will kill a bad product faster than anything.
exactly. I mean, it's about a balance. Obviously, my example was a bit exaggerated there, but that attitude, I find it's quite prevalent amongst marketers, and I do feel the need to push back and just say that, hey, we value what we do, right? But at the end of the day, we're doing this in service of a business, and there are many elements that go into making a business successful. I mean, if as a marketer, my dream job, honestly, is having a great product because a great product sells itself. I don't have to do anything, right? I can just call myself a marketer and, I get to take the credit, right? But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that
Can
go
I
into
push
great
back
marketing.
on that in just a sec, Vivek?
Sure, sure.
You said a great product sells itself. Well, it really doesn't
Mm,
unless the world knows about that great product, right? So, I mean, marketing has to play a role in getting a great product out there. I just had Marshall Goldsmith on the show a couple episodes ago, and of course, some claim he to be the number one executive coach in the world. And one of the
mm.
points that he made on the show that I kind of smiled at and sort of was surprised at is he said, the biggest challenge to great leaders and great companies is humility sometimes. Humility in marketing, that they don't share with the world the kinds of impacts that they can actually have. They don't like to talk about, they just think that their great exploits and their great product or service are going to be found out and naturally sell themselves. But without good story marketing, I don't think that's the case.
I do agree with that. And I must clarify when I said that a great product sells itself, what I meant is as a marketer, I don't need to spend perhaps as much time figuring out how to sell it as opposed to another product in a really crowded space that is not super differentiated, which, to be fair, is the reality in which I work because I am almost entirely in the B2B world. I'm in technology, I'm in financial technology specifically, and institutional finance, where and tech as well, where a lot of products are very nuanced, right? So figuring out the stories for these products is quite challenging. And then you look over at the B2C space where you have a lot of products that are super differentiated. Figuring out the story there is also challenging, but not as, I would say, an exercise in figuring out nuances as much as it is in B2B. So that's
Yeah.
my, I would say, yeah, asterisk on that statement.
Yeah, and all my listeners know where I'm going with this next sentiment. Vivek, B2B stands, of course, for what? Business to business, right?
Hmm.
But when it comes to their communications, I maintain that for 95% of B2B brands, it stands for boring to bored. That B2B companies can't get out of their own logic driven, reasoned way to tell their stories when it's the emotion that counts. And so leads to my next question is, you are an expert at really understanding audiences, the right questions to ask them. And I really love this on the heels of the episode that I just did with Sean Grace about the art of the question. Now, and by the way, folks, that was episode number 487, if you haven't heard it. His was more about the right questions to ask in leadership and innovation, collaboration, and whatever. Yours, Vivek, as I understand, is more about really unlocking those insights with customers so you know the right questions to ask of them in order to invite them into your B2B story.
Yeah, and I think you used a very important word over there, which is emotion. And emotion is something that you just don't think about in terms of a B2B product, right? Because you're selling to bigger companies, you're selling to executives, you're selling to buying committees. And where does emotion figure in all that? It's all logical, it's all about cost. Well, the funny thing is, the more I've operated in B2B, the more I've realized that the biggest emotion that really drives purchase decisions, right, is fear. And that's a very basic emotion. That's a really strong emotion. And ultimately, that's what drives purchases. Now, I'm not saying that all B2B marketing needs to be fear driven, right? That's not it. But it's just a pushback against this thought that B2B needs to be logical and full of jargon and it needs to be super technical. It needs to be those things, but that does not mean it should be devoid of emotion, right? The other thing that I would push back on, with due respect, is when you said B2B boring to bored. Look, I agree with it. All right. I mean, it's not super exciting. It's not like reading your favorite author or whatever. But I do think that some of that boring persona that B2B content gets, is just a function of the content not being for a wide audience, right? Because I operate in pretty technical sort of sectors, which is like fintech, which is heavily regulated. It needs to follow all these laws or whatever. Sometimes there's no option but to create something that looks like boilerplate text because you're not allowed to say anything else, right? So
Hmm.
there is that issue to deal with. But
Well, let
sometimes,
me ask
yeah,
you this though, Vivek. To that point, you're not allowed to say anything else. Why can you? Why can you not, like a news person, tell a factual story about the impact that your tech has had on a patient, on a hospital, whatever it might be? So you are actually telling a true story that delivers that emotion, connects with that emotion you're looking for, but illustrates your B2B offering in action, the outcomes that you actually make. Now, there's no one that can restrict you from talking about that, right?
absolutely not. Customer stories and case studies, as we call them, they are an important part of driving that emotion. Ultimately, though, there comes a point where the people consuming those stories, our audience, they want to know how your product works. And I think that's where the real challenge comes in with regards to emotion and storytelling, right? What story do I tell when my product is really, it's the infrastructure that helps you issue a credit card, for example? Where's the emotion
Mm-hmm.
in that, right? So I think when we talk about storytelling in B2B, right, and when I say we, I mean all of us people who consume content, who read content online, we're kind of conditioned to think of a story as being something that is super entertaining, that has a certain few recognizable markers, right? Things like snappy writing, things like snappy intros, great hooks, or whatever, things that keeps you engaged throughout, or something like that. We don't think of storytelling in terms of being audience appropriate. We don't think of storytelling in terms of telling a product story through technical details. We don't think always of storytelling in terms of telling stories through data or numbers, right? I mean, I actually have a good example of this, which was one of my clients. There's actually a former client. They were in the what's called the FP&A space, right, which is financial planning and analysis. Super boring, not anything that your everyday person would be involved with. Just in a nutshell, what they do is they help companies figure out where they stand, right? So you have revenue coming in from 100 different places. Where will you land in 6 months? If you hire 10 more people, how is that going to affect it? So on, all this financial modeling stuff. So the something that we discovered during when we conducted customer research was that the people consuming this kind of content, they actually don't want the traditional hallmarks of storytelling. you know they don't they don't have time to sit there and read content. So you just have to really get to it very quickly, as in don't waste time setting the scene, which is a traditional storytelling hallmark, right? Don't waste your time doing that. Just get to the point. Tell me what's on the page. Give me lots of data. Give me lots of tables. Let me figure it out, because this is what I do for a living. So we weren't telling a story in a traditional way, but every piece of content was still telling a story. It just wasn't recognizable as what a story is. And this goes back to my point about the B2B definition, right? And my pushback on it, which is that we don't recognize a lot of B2B content as being traditional stories. And so we kind of paint a brush saying that, oh, this is boring. I'm not saying all B2B content is great, but I'm also saying that a lot of B2B content that is painted as boring is definitely not boring for its audience, right? It's a different form of storytelling. And I think customer
Mm-hmm.
research and understanding and asking them the right questions, asking them, what are your expectations over here? What does a successful product look like? Right? How many people are involved in the decision? Who is involved in it? Understanding all these different elements is really the key to figuring out what story you need to tell. So sometimes you end up in these situations where it's almost anti storytelling, but you're still telling a story that is relevant to the audience, right? So yeah, that's what I would say is super interesting about B2B. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you tiptoed into this, so let's dive headlong into the questions you ask. How do you unlock these customer insights? And what you had just mentioned there, Vivek, is that felt like kind of your sales discovery. You know, who's got to make the decision, who needs to be in the room, how do you approach that first from marketing to get the attention to the brand? I have this thing called the know, like, and trust storytelling flywheel based off of Jim Collins' famous proven flywheel effect. And first, that brand has got to be known for something. That B2B brand has to be known. And then you have to, level up the likability quotient through how you connect with your audiences, first on an emotional level, then on a logic reason driven level, even if they're, stone cold engineers in the tech world or the financial planning world. And then it leads, of course, to the trust. Once they've bought into your story, become a participant in your story, you deliver on those promises you make in your story, to the narrative to get them in. Then they begin not only as repeat customers, but sharing your story with the world through word of mouth marketing, the most powerful form of advertising there is, free referrals. So let's jump in. To really make that know, like, and trust storytelling flywheel work, you've got to unlock these customer insights. So how do you do that?
Well, before I dive into it, I just want to say I kind of stumbled into this process just by doing what I usually do, which is where the best ideas come from, right? So usually when I start
Right?
working with clients, I have this pretty sort of lengthy onboarding process where I really need to understand everything that they're doing, right? And it confuses people sometimes. It's like, listen, I just want you to give me some words on a page. Why do you need me to answer all these questions, right? And I think it sort of shows how people and founders, especially CEOs, executives, they're not always on the same page as marketing. So one of the things that I started doing was posing questions to them to help them see why I need this data, right? And that's where these questions come from, which is asking them, okay, it goes, there's the simple ones, which is like, okay, who's your customer, right? What pain are they experiencing? Those are pretty straightforward. That's something everybody does. But going beyond that, and I mentioned a few of these, which is what does success look like? Where do they turn to for information, right? Not just the sources, but also in which order. Because a lot of research data in B2B says that before, let's say I'm in the market for a product, I've already made up my mind. I've already reduced my list to sort of 3 or 4 brands and companies. I'm not looking outside that list. So when I'm conducting research on solutions, I'm just going to these 3, 4 places. So if a company is outside that list, and if it's just talking about pain points or something like that, that's not good enough because nobody's ever going to find them, right? So it was asking these kinds of questions. It was like, okay, put yourself in your customer's shoes. Do you know this about your customers? And more often than not, people were coming back to me saying, hey, listen, can you send us that list? Because we want to send them to our customers, right? We want to see what they say. Like, how do they make this decision? Because they didn't have that data. So that's where the thought of turning these questions into a resource came to my mind. And the way I usually conduct it is I do ask those questions, but then I also dive deeper, which is talking to people who are involved with customers on a daily basis. And it's not just about talking to sales or customer service or customer success, as it's called in the B2B tech world. You have to go beyond that. I also love, especially talking to the product team, right? The developers, especially the business analysts, because the business analysts are the ones who are translating, they're speaking to customers, they're figuring out, like, okay, this is what you need, this is what we need to be building on the back end, right? Speaking to these
Mm-hmm.
people, it gives you a well-rounded view of what your customer is like, because the customers behave one way with sales and they behave another when a BA is asking them, like, what do you expect from the product, right? And
Mm-hmm.
the answers sometimes are quite surprising, where it just points to a bit of a slightly different emotion involved over there. They might tell sales that, yeah, this is our pain point, we really want to sort of solve this. But then when they're speaking to the BA, they say something like, yeah, this functionality is pretty straightforward.
And you're saying BA. What's that stand
Sorry, yeah,
for?
I should have. BA stands for business analyst. So any
The business analyst.
yeah, so any sort
Mhm.
of technical team that's developing a product has this one person who speaks to customers and translates that business speak into technical speak, right? So that's a pretty important role in these teams. And just understanding that, right? And you speak to these different people from different viewpoints almost, and you kind of understand that, okay, this is what customers are thinking, and then that gives you a good ground to see, okay, should I be asking more questions? Is this something I should be digging into deeper? And unfortunately, a lot of companies don't do that, right? The marketers also at these companies, they kind of stop at talking to sales. They talk to maybe customer success or customer service, and that's it. And you get this one dimensional view of your customer. You create content based on that. And is it any wonder that you're not getting picked in that initial list when
Mhm.
people are researching, right? So yeah, that's kind of how I would approach the two things: the importance of asking questions as well as which questions to ask. So yeah.
Okay, so we've got that at a high level, Vivek. Show it to us in action. Can you take us to a moment in time where maybe you learned this or you saw it or you are working with a client customer and they're not closing the deals, they're not even getting invited to the table because they're not asking the right questions? Take us to a moment. Show it to us in action,
Yeah, I'd
please.
love to. One of my favorite sort of stories to tell, appropriate for this podcast, right? This is my story.
Absolutely.
One of my favorite stories to tell is with a startup. So this startup was, well, they still are around. When I worked with them, they were still in an early stage. So they were headed into that, first round of funding, and they really needed to make a bang with that particular round. They had certain targets to hit.
And what was their product or service?
The product is this platform. It's an AI platform for accountants, right? That's the easiest way to describe it.
Mhm.
So,
Okay.
accounting, and just as a bit of a background, the reason for this product existing is accounting processes, highly manual, very sort of resource intensive, lots of communication breakdowns. Everybody's on the same Excel sheet, numbers changing all over the place. I don't know who changed what, who should I yell at, right? I mean, and it's stressful. And all these things need to
Oh
get
yeah.
done within like 3 days at the end of the month, right? And if I don't finish it within those 3 days, the CEO is on me saying that, hey, listen, you guys need to give me numbers. You haven't given me anything. Where's our business going, right? Am I going to lose my job now? Like, nobody knows. So that's why this platform exists. It just automates a lot of things, and it kind of solves all these problems, right? So the pain point research that the company had initially conducted pointed to everything that I just said, which is, all right, this is a pain point. This is what we need to solve. Let's go ahead and solve it. So they have this AI agent that's built on top of ChatGPT. It sort of scours the US accounting regulations, and it tells an accountant that, okay, what you're doing here might be a bit risky, but it's legal. And what you're doing here might be illegal, right? And a lot of accounting is making those kinds of subjective decisions. So, as an accountant, it really helps me understand the context behind certain things, right? So, they were creating this content that was based on these pain points. They were telling the story that, listen, your problem is, you manual processes and this and that. So, here's our AI. This is the hero that's going to solve your problem, right? But nobody was signing up. And the reason for that is because this is something that we discovered on deeper customer research, on digging deeper into understanding how accountants think and what they're actually doing day to day. Accountants have a huge fear of AI. They are absolutely scared of being replaced by AI and automation, and they're not
Mhm.
alone in that, right? But accounting, especially in the financial world, it's a function that is sort of viewed as a back office, kind of like the IT department, but except with numbers. And everybody sort of has this feeling in that department that, listen, they're going to bring in the machines. They're just going to have the machines do everything, and we'll be without a job, right? So anytime this company was addressing accountants going on these sales calls, the accountants were always blocking the deal. Like, why would anybody
Well,
sign up?
what's interesting Vivek, is that you all, as the brand, were focused on this AI as the hero, and yet your potential customers and prospects were looking at it as the villain.
The exact opposite of what we wanted, right? So that's once we realized that okay, the story needs to change. And again, the way we realized it was just by asking questions. So the process was listening to sales calls and actually listening, right? Not hearing, not reading transcripts, actually listening, because then you can understand why certain questions are coming up, what the context is. Speaking to accountants out in the field, speaking to existing customers, and one thing kept coming up over and over again with existing customers, which was, oh wow, this hasn't replaced me as yet. I'm actually doing my job better. And that was one that was I'm paraphrasing, of course, but that was one of the huge insights that we had. And that informed the story moving forward, which is we might be talking about different topics. We might be writing, say, something like a how-to article. We might be publishing a video like about, I don't know, the latest accounting regulation announcement from the government, whatever. Underlying that, the brand story, the strategic narrative, whatever you want to call it, was always AI is your assistant, right? You are Batman and AI is Robin, right? It's not the other way around. So you always need, every superhero needs an assistant. That was literally in terms of a
A
persona.
sidekick.
Exactly, a
Yeah.
sidekick, a superpowered sidekick who does not sleep, does not need much maintenance, is always up to date. Why wouldn't you want to have that kind of a sidekick? And
And
once
to
we,
make your life easier.
yeah, once we
Yeah.
started doing that, the change in terms of how people perceive the product on sales calls and also within the industry was so, I mean, it was a marked shift. And this is one of my proudest moments. Was I was on a sales call with another client, right? And I kind of asked them, I was like, this is a standard question I ask prospective clients, which is, whose content do you like, right? Like, so that I can get an idea of the style or whatever that you prefer. And they pointed to this other company's content, the accounting company's content. And I hadn't told them that they're my client, right? So that was one of the best compliments that I ever received. And for me, that was ultimate proof that okay, something's working here. And it just came
Mm.
down to what I said before about most companies stop at that pain points. They don't go beyond that. It was going beyond that that really transformed content and helped us tell the right story, right? So yeah.
Do you remember what the aha moment was? Were you sitting there listening, also with your customer, or was your client listening, and they finally heard it for the umpteenth time and go, "Oh, that's what the real problem is."
It was a combination of hearing a lot of calls, and the aha moment was kind of spread out, right? It required a little bit of input from different sources. The first input was the calls that I mentioned, and I picked up something there, which is like, okay, they're being a bit negative here, right? And I could understand that. Okay, they're scared of being replaced by technology, but clearly the product is not going to do that. Like I could see it. Why
Mhm.
can't they see it, right? The second input came from me literally sitting there and reading through this trade journal. It's not a trade journal, it's more like a website that accountants have. It's called Going Concern. And this website is full of like accounting snark. That's the best way I can describe it. It's full of like these jokes. It's full of like, accountants bashing this and that. It's a hilarious website if you get the accounting world.
Wait a minute, accountants are hilarious?
Exactly. They're not just bean counters or whatever, right? And this is what I mean about B2B, right? Like you just don't know. It's like, yeah, accountants are hilarious. Who knew? So there's this website with all these amazing jokes or whatever. And when I was reading that, the recurrent theme was nobody appreciates us. That's where these jokes are coming from. The third input that I had that sort of precipitated this aha moment was Reddit. So I went on the accounting Reddit and I went on related finance subreddits as well, reading everything that was going on over there. And it was a mix. It was a mix of young accountants asking for advice, older accountants explaining why they were quitting, accountants who had shifted to an adjacent function explaining why. Reading all this, again, the recurrent theme was nobody appreciates us, right? So you add all this together and it's like, okay, this is why they can't see this is why they see the product as a threat, because they're beginning with the assumption that okay, we're going to get replaced. So anything that, no matter how legitimate it is as a replacement potentially, gets looked at as a threat. And it was really understanding and putting all these things together that helped us form the story that, okay, you know what? You're not underappreciated. You are a superhero. You're Batman, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is why you need the assistant.
Mm-hmm.
And more importantly, having pretty much memorized word for word this snarky accounting publication, we were able to throw some jokes in there, which was even greater, right? So really, it helped us speak the language, and yeah, that's something I'm super proud of. Yeah.
Yeah, you were dealing with an anti-story of we're accountants, we're unappreciated, and AI is going to come and take our livelihood. So that's a story your prospects are telling themselves. And the only way you're going to overcome that story is with a better story that shows them what a shared vision for tomorrow can be. I would suggest, and you can push back on me certainly on this, that no amount of data, charts, and graphs, and stats and features are going to overcome that anti story because it is emotionally charged. The only way you are going to get their attention and at least start to influence and persuade them is with a more powerful, truthful story that triggers that emotion in them. I heard someone the other day say, and I love this, emotion is just energy in motion.
Love
So
it.
the idea is you want to trigger that energy in motion and get it out of that anti story and get them to consider your point of view from a different point of view that they currently have. And you went in and did this by really understanding what made them tick. How many hours do you think, and I get to ask this question a lot, Park, how do I research my customers and how long is it going to take? Everyone quite often thinks they got to spend, loads and loads of money with research companies and whatever. And the fact of the matter is you don't. You can do it with just investing some hours. How much time did you have in finally coming to that realization of how to communicate with these accountants? And what was the outcome?
That's a very good question. So when I started sort of implementing my little onboarding process and asking these questions, this was one of the biggest objections that I ran into, which is, listen, we don't have the time for this. We're busy running our companies, right? So I was like, okay, that's fair. I'm a marketer. I'm not the most important person in the room here. I have that humility, right? So how do I make this better? Well, the best way that I have found so far, I'm not saying this is the absolute best way. This is the best way that I have figured out, is to take a iterative approach, right? And it's understanding that, okay, the answers that I have today might not be the same as the ones I have tomorrow, because things change, right? People are people, markets change all the time, preferences change. It's perfectly normal. What's important is to devote a little bit of time on a consistent basis, right? So it's not like you just do this for 100 hours on the first day, or whatever, the first week or whatever. Well, fit 100,
That's a long day.
yeah, fit 100 hours into a day. Yeah, superheroes, right? Anyway, so fit it into this 1 week, and then you don't have to worry about it for the rest of all time. That's not how it works. It's about, you learn as best as you can, you publish your messaging, which I like to call the testing phase, right? The third is basically you refine it. So you get feedback based on whatever content you're publishing out there. Seek feedback, more importantly, because a lot of companies don't actually seek feedback. They just want the results to come pouring in, right? So seek feedback and then refine based on that. And once you start taking all these sort of the feedback, the data that you get from there into account, you'll tweak your story, right? And it's a process of constantly tweaking it, because sometimes your audience, they might prefer that you meet them somewhere else. Going back to this company,
Mm-hmm.
right, the AI for accountants company that I mentioned, when they were at an early stage, a lot of their customers wanted the company to meet them on social media, right? Now they're slightly bigger, they're a more mature company. they that social media need is still there, but the audience has grown so much because they're just a bigger company. The majority of people just want to find them on Google, right? So the method of communication has changed, and with that, there are certain stories that you can share very well on social media. They don't transfer well to a long form blog, right? So you're going to have to figure out that, okay, how can I massage the story a little bit? What sort of content assets should I be using? Should I be using video? Should I be using more pictures? Is text the only way I can do this? It's iterative. It keeps changing. So devoting a little bit of time at periodic intervals, and that's the best way of doing it. The worst thing to do is to do it once and forget it. And so, to go back to your question, devoting lots of time to it upfront, I would say that's the wrong way of doing it. You want to test quickly and you want to keep moving forward and constantly refining. That's how I would approach it.
That's great. And it's a living, breathing exercise, isn't it? You are there as the market is evolving, as the tastes and the sentiments are evolving, so that you, as the brand and the narrative creator, storyteller, can evolve along with it. You had mentioned earlier, Vivek, especially in the high-tech world, these big thinkers, financial, whatever, I don't have time for a story. Just, let me, show me the numbers. I'm going to figure it out. What if I could show you a 3-word story structure that you could use in your world with them that essentially is not a story, but within 15 seconds, you can hook that prospect's mind using the 3 forces of story of agreement, contradiction, consequence. Can I put you in the hot seat and we'll give it a go? Because are you aware of the and, but, therefore, the ABT that we teach and share?
I am reasonably aware of it, yes.
Well, let's walk through it real quick.
Absolutely.
And by the way, you can punch holes in it. You can do anything you like. This is free form, right?
Sure.
So, but I just love to test it on brilliant minds like yourself. Let's take your customer, the accounting AI software customer, all right? And let's build a very, very quick ABT for them. And of course, the and, but, therefore works because it uses that 3 forces of story of agreement, contradiction, consequence that leads to understanding of your audience, appreciating what they want and why it's important to them relative to your offering, and then empathizing with them as to why they don't currently have it. What is the main pain point that you are going to help solve for them? Setup, problem, resolution, something that literally could be delivered in 15 seconds to capture the attention of one of those big thinkers that has no time for a story. All right. So who is, and I always like to go through this step, who's the number one audience? That audience, that persona that's making up 80% of the sales for that customer. What do they want relative to the offering, and why is it important to them? By communicating a shared vision for them in the future, so that they're nodding like you're nodding right now, saying, yeah, you understand me and you appreciate what I want, why it's important to me. But here's the contradiction, here's the conflict. What emotion, what fear, as you mentioned earlier, are they experiencing because of what problem? Therefore, imagine their relief when they do this with your AI. So with that in process, can we build an ABT really quick for your particular client?
Sure. So my audience is an accountant at a relatively large firm who's wasting a ton of time on manual tasks and not hitting their goals on time, not hitting their performance metrics on time. Or maybe a better way of saying that, to satisfy the company executives, right? That's a better way of saying it. And then we go into the but. Can you remind me again?
Actually, can I stop you right there? Let's keep that and statement of agreement positive. You already have outlined the but you are not satisfying your executive leadership because you're not turning things in on time due to the manual aspects of your work. So we want to find that hurt. They're not turning in they're not satisfying their executives, and then we want to amplify that pain because you have all these manual tasks that are slowing you down, right? So let's go back. Then we have identified what the problem is. Let's go back to that statement of agreement. You are a professional accountant in a relatively large firm, and what do they want to accomplish, and your number one goal is to satisfy the C-suite with your numbers, and if you can do that, then you can generate more growth or whatever. I'm just kind of ad-libbing at this point. What would be the positive outcome that they want that they could get through your AI, but that they don't currently have, and we have not introduced the solution yet?
Yeah, they can get a strategic seat at the table, move from the back office to being a strategic driver of the business.
So that's really what's driving them, as they are this professional accountant, a relatively large firm, and you want and if you could get a strategic place at the table, then you could have an even greater impact on the success of the enterprise. So that's great.
Yeah.
They want emotionally to have a seat at the table, no longer be that back office thing, the front office person that is being recognized for having this major impact. And then, of course, in that recognition, then they get, more sustainability in their job, the more confidence that they're going to be keeping around. But you are not satisfying your executive branch. They may even think you're underperforming because of all this time-intensive tasks that is slowing your productivity down.
Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, the second part, totally agree with it. I would say the third bit, or the final bit that you said, I would just say it's because you lack the right tools, right? You lack
Okay.
the sort of, yeah, just to amplify the pain, I would say
Yeah.
you lack the right tools. You need something that just sort of brings everything together in one spot. So I think we're moving to the solution now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, we are. Therefore. So then the next thing I want you to think about, Vivek, is right after the therefore, do not introduce the brand or the solution. Introduce emotionally what's in it for your audience. Therefore, and you could even replace the therefore with imagine or picture. Imagine expediting your workflow by 10 times and having that impact with the C-suite you seek when you introduce your product as your accounting sidekick. It's working while you're sleeping.
Yeah. I would actually tweak that to say, imagine becoming literally, imagine being viewed as a superhero within your business instead of just as, well, the instead doesn't come in the messaging, but it's just to contrast how accountants are usually viewed versus being the strategic superhero with the numbers, right? Yeah, I think that's the train of thought I would take it along.
I love that.
Yeah.
And I love that you brought up contrast, because contrast is so important. You want to build contrast between that statement of agreement, what do they want, and then the statement of contradiction, why they don't have it. Create as much contrast as you can there. What you're doing is triggering that primal pattern-seeking, problem-solving, decision-making, buying limbic brain that operates in the background, in the back office of our subconscious, and it's where our real decisions are being made. So why not speak directly to it?
Absolutely, and I think it's a fantastic framework because it simplifies the messaging so much that I love it. One thing I would like to point out though is the challenge, I think, is in understanding what to talk about, right? Because even if we talk about this particular firm, we could have stopped at the pain points. We could have said something like, okay, too much manual tasks. Imagine in the therefore part, right? We could have said something like, imagine having a tool that saves you time, right? Or that gets you a strategic seat at the table. I'm still mentioning the outcome, the positive outcome, which they love. But the way I am framing it is still something that's not going to land based on customer research, which is I'm still framing AI. I've not really removed AI as a threat. That's where the emotion is from the limbic mind, the monkey mind that you mentioned. That's where the emotion is, and I think that's where really the research comes into play. It's about asking those questions that helps you understand. Okay, this is what we should talk about. I can frame it this way, which is brilliant, and it's just concise. It can infuse my content throughout, but to get there, I need to ask the right questions. And I just feel like a lot of companies don't spend time asking the right questions, or even worse, they look at what the competition is doing and they just sort of borrow that playbook, right? This is very prevalent in B2B. You look at the competition, you see that, okay, this is how they're talking about their product. So we need to do the same thing, but let's just adjust the word
Yeah.
positions a bit, right? They say and or, we're going to say or and, right? That's literally sometimes what happens.
But you make a very good point, Vivek, that ABTs do not work without the research. And even it was a great example of as I was simply walking through the structure of the ABT and how you use it, but you kept infusing in insights that you have that I don't have, that you have about your customer. And I could hear how you were actually evolving the content within the ABT to have even more impact on your audience. And so what I like to share with people is when I teach them about the ABT, I am teaching you a framework in which to hang your content on that is enormously powerful, but you, and you demonstrated this very well, you are the content expert. You have done your research. You know how to copyright that. All I'm giving you is the framework in which to put your content. So I love the fact that you are underscoring that you got to ask the right questions. You got to know your audience inside and out if you are going to have the impact, and then simply use that story structure of the ABT, which is actually not a story. Again, it's just using those three forces of story to be able to hook that audience immediately up front. Now you're inside their head, their monkey brain, monkeying around with that limbic decision-making, problem-solving brain, which then opens the door for you as the marketer, salesperson, or whatever to really connect with that audience and then deliver the goods. Get into the more logic and reason once you've opened that door. You had mentioned, and we'll close on this. You've got a resource for our listeners, and it's I think the questions that your clients have asked of you, saying, "Hey, can you put this down so that I know how to do that too?" Can you tell us a little bit about that resource and where can people get it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think these questions really form the foundation of any content strategy. If you're a company looking to get more customers through its content, right? I think asking these questions should be an essential first step. And, like you pointed out, I mean, these questions just came from me asking them and customers being like, hey, can you send us a copy, right? Because we didn't think of this before. The best place to
Can you give
find
us an example of some of the questions that you asked?
Sure. I've mentioned quite a few of them on this call. Some of them are really diving into the reasoning behind the purchase, like, going beyond the pain point, as in, like, okay, you're comparing these two products, right? What feature or what looks like success to you, right? Within a certain product. Why did you consider these products in the first place, right? What does the decision making process look like? Who is involved in it? What tends to be the biggest roadblock in this deal? Now, the customer's not going to answer that directly. This question really comes up after you analyze the answers from the original list, right? So the best place to find it would be on my website, which is my name, which is vivekshankar.net. You'll see a little tab called Strategy Decoded. You can download the resource. It's absolutely free. There's no email needed, nothing of that sort. And I firmly believe that these questions should be the foundation of everything you do in content marketing, and it absolutely has a result. It's what my clients have experienced. Yeah, I'm just super stoked to share it. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate that, and our listeners will too. We'll have a link in the show notes for them. And as you mentioned, content marketing, one of my favorite sentiments is you've all heard, the line, if content is king,
Yeah.
right? They used to say. My argument is, yeah, content may be king, but storytelling is the kingdom's sorcerer, because that's really where the magic happens, and you can really use it to great effect in the business to business world, taking you from being boring to bored to brilliance.
Awesome. I love it. And it's true, it's such a good point you bring up, which is uh, I've spoken to quite a few founders and they're always told invest in content, right? But they don't know what content looks like. And that's why you have this current sort of boring to bored sort of thing going on. And it's such a shame. Yeah.
Well, Vivek, thank you so much for your time coming to us from Lisbon. How did you find that? Was my final question. Let's bring this thing full circle. You grew up in India, went to the U.S., to the States, and now find yourself in Lisbon. Why? Why Lisbon?
So after I went to the States and then I quit my job. I went back to India to start my own business, and then after that, I found myself in Dubai, in the UAE, and I started living the digital nomad lifestyle because I was location independent as a marketer, and Lisbon kept coming up all the time. A lot of people kept telling me Portugal's wonderful, this and that. You should go check it out. And I checked it out. I loved it, and yeah, applied for a residence. And it's I haven't traveled anywhere in a year, so which is a lot for me. So I love it. Yeah, that's how I'm here.
Well, that's awesome. We'll have to come and visit you if you're still there in another year
Absolutely.
or so. Would love to. I've heard Lisbon is a beautiful place. But thank you, Vivek, for taking the time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Bart. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to and sharing this edition of The Business of Story. And if you do me a huge favor, please jump on over to iTunes and give us a rating and review for our show. It certainly helps us get found in the loud, cacophonous world we all compete in. I'd like to thank Caden Howell for producing and editing our show, Marissa Hill for ongoing marketing and community development, and Darius Holbert for our amazing custom theme music. Join me next Monday to learn how to perfect your presentation skills, your speaking with acclaimed coach Lori Schloff. You're going to love her. And until then, remember that the most potent story you will ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make that one a great one. Thanks so much for listening.